Okay, so working on assignment 3, continuing it, let's just quickly see what we've done so far. We sketched possible thumbnail compositions, keeping in mind the rule of thirds, which I can get a quick snapshot of if I just use the crop tool. And the rule of thirds states that focal points are most effective when they intersect with third lines. And so even though I have a fairly central composition here, I have a nice intersection with the edge of that with a third line there. And all the third line intersections are contained within my object, which should mean that the eye can follow around it and have a lot of room to move around within it before it leaves. So we're going for optimal eye movement, dynamic eye movement and engagement. But the problem is when we get an exposure, the temperature of our lighting might color that exposure. So the next thing we did was we used Channel Mixer under Image Adjustments to mix out in both the red, in all 3 channels, the red, green, and blue channels, which is a way the computer sees color, because those are the 3 colors the computer uses to make all the other colors. The reason our monitors are called RGB monitors is because they have red, green, and blue lights. And so I made those adjustments and I stopped them when it looked like the yellow was more like a neutral gray, shifting the different scales. Then I make a duplicate of that layer and I play with the levels adjustment. You know, the lights and the darks, and optimize that. And I'm not trying to get my white to be solid white. I'm trying to just get it so that it's right on the edge of the exposure. Okay, so far so good. Now that I have an optimized histogram, I did an adjustment layer of the channel mixer one more time. And here it actually shows you my settings, so I can show you how I play with it. And I want to just make sure I'm at neutral white as much as possible in the red channel, in the green channel, and it's worth revisiting every once in a while, and in the blue channel. Otherwise, when you print it, even though it looks good to you on the screen, you're going to realize that what you thought was white is instead a subtle pink. So you're always just adjusting that color balance through the channel mixer. The reason to do that with a white background is now I know that the colors on this object are true. They're not overly yellow, they're not overly green, they are true to what the exposure has. And then, in order to do some other things now, that's just cleaning up the exposure. In order to retouch it and to fix it up, I am going to flatten it all onto one layer, but still keep these layers there in case I screw up. And so what I do is I select the top layer, I hold down Option, and I go to Layer, Merge, Visible. And it flattens it all onto layer 2 right there. And now on layer 2, I can use some of the retouching tools we used with assignment 3. I could use the patch tool. I can use the spot correction tool, little debris. I don't need to make it super airbrushed and perfect, but I want to take away any visual distractions because I'm going for an eye movement that's really engaged. And from my thumbnails, if I open those up, because we're going to be uploading our sketches as well to meet all the requirements. In my thumbnails, that kind of introduced me to the subject. My favorite compositions that I kind of mimicked here weren't because they used the third lines as much as that they really engage the eye. So I'm using a shadow and I'm using the piece in a certain orientation to hopefully really keep the viewer's eye engaged in the object before it leaves. And they always leave at the bottom right. So another way to play with eye movement, now that we can just make adjustments, like retouching, like dodging and burning, doing kind of spot correction tools, is to bring out focal points on our object itself or strengthen them. So if I use the dodge tool directly on this layer, or I can do what we were doing before, create a new blank layer if I want to have a protective layer, fill it with 50% gray and set it to overlay mode. I can dodge right on here using midtones at a low exposure and bring out some highlights, like maybe along this edge. Not overdone, very carefully done. Just bring out a little bit of highlight, and then on the other side, I can burn it same way with the midtones. It's a way of kind of spot treating your levels. And because we're treating the background separately than our object, it makes you kind of adjust the levels in this way. Now it's all on this layer, this overlay layer. And I love that because it's really easy to overdo dodging and burning. And so by having it on its own layer, I can then just play with opacity and scale it back if I need to. And usually I'd have a lot of fun playing with that, but I'm trying to go fast. So I'm just going to do a little bit of dodging and burning to bring it out. Right? Yep, looks pretty good. Okay, but you can also dodge and burn the background. So I have this other layer right here where I filled it with an overlay. I'll just remind you how to do that. I created a new blank layer. I say edit fill 50% gray, and then switch it from normal mode to overlay mode. And now I can dodge and burn on this with impunity. And I'll start with the midtones really large. And this is what's called vignetting. And this will be a dark vignette. It's like giving yourself a little bit of a soft-edged frame around your image to just kind of subconsciously keep the viewer's eye within your frame. And just very soft. And the problem is I've been dodging it instead of burning it. So I was doing it opposite, which is actually kind of nice. I think I might prefer it. So you see how it gets brighter around the edges? That's a light vignette. And that can work in very much the same way. Now, why am I doing midtones instead of highlights? Well, if I dodge highlights, just like if I burn shadows, it will go very quickly to losing information in the exposure. It will go to pure white. And this will not, because this will only affect the midtones, not the brightest dots. So even where I vignetted pretty heavily on the bottom here, you can still see the texture of the canvas that I shot on, no matter how much I vignette. It will only start to blur because of focus, not because of lack of exposure. All right. What if I wanted to burn it the other way? Or vignette it the other way? Well, let's try it that way. Edit, fill, 50% gray, set it to overlay mode. You are not required to use a vignette, but it can make it more effective. So I just do the same thing now with the burn tool on midtones. Nice and big. And an exposure less than 30, because it works pretty fast. Very soft-edged brush, and start painting the edges. Just darkening them slightly. And you see that frames it in. with a little dark halo. It's funny because while you're doing it, you can't even tell it's doing anything. But when you turn it off and on, you see, yes, indeed. That kind of keeps my eye engaged. So what do I like though? Do I like it lighter at the edges? Or do I like it darker at the edges? Or do I like it just as it is? Decisions, decisions. Strangely enough, I kind of like it with both of them overlaid on top of each other. Just because it kind of cleans up the outside a little bit. Whereas the shadow's a little too dark there. And the shadow's a little too dark here. The light vignette takes care of that. But then it looks a little too blah. So the dark vignette gives it a little bit more edge, especially on the top. So that might be the most effective. And of course, I can play with different amounts of opacity and decide just how much of that I want. Maybe 0, maybe 30, how old am I now? 37. I always try to pick significant opacity percentage numbers when I can't make up my mind. All right, so that looks pretty good. I've dodged it and burned it. That helps. Makes it more visually engaging. Now the last thing I can play with is the edge control. And I shot this with a fairly open aperture, like about an f4, and zoomed in. So only about ½ an inch of it in depth is in focus in the middle there. So it's a little blurry here in the foreground, and it's a little blurry at the back edge, intentionally. But what if I wanted to do that even more? Well, this is where it gets complicated, but I wanted to show you this technique, even if I don't think this photo needs it. What I do is I am going to switch from the layer mode to what's called the channels mode. And if you don't see channels, you can find it under window and check on channels, but it's usually kept next to layers. Remember how we talked about how your computer sees in 3 colors? Red, green, and blue? Well, channels allows you to access each of those. So this is my image with just the blue channel. And computers are binary, right? They either see in black or white. So this is the blue lights that are turned on for my image. They're actually mostly turned off, because when they're black, you can see they're turned off. They're turned on where the white is, because white is made with all 3 colors turned all the way on. This is the blue with the green channel. This is the green channel on its own. And you see when green and blue light overlap, you actually get yellow. And there's quite a bit of yellow in my object. Then the red channel, with RGB, I get full color. This is red with blue. Pretty intense. Gives you magenta. And here is red with green. Whoa. Right. So you need all 3 channels. What's cool about Photoshop is I can add a channel just like I can add a layer. And that's what's called an alpha channel. And what I'm going to do with this alpha channel is paint a gradation using a standard gradient tool that just goes from white to black. I'm going to paint a depth map of my scene. And the foreground of my scene is here. The background of my scene, what's furthest away, is towards the back, over here. So that's my depth map. Might be a little bit more angular like that. This is the extreme foreground, this is the extreme background. I turn RGB back on, and if I have the alpha channel on, it will show as kind of a reddish glare. Okay? What this will allow me to do, I'm going to turn it off for now, but it's still there. I select RGB, I go back to layers, and now what I do is I am going to flatten everything onto one layer again. Hold down Option, I'm on the very top layer. Hold down Option, go to Layer, say Merge Visible. And now on this top layer, I am going to play with a filter. That's a blur filter. And we've used Gaussian blur before. So let me show you what that does. That just takes all the resolution down. So blurs the focus everywhere. What I'm going to do is use my alpha channel and use lens blur to actually direct that blur. That will be the next